The American forces, on the other hand, were equipped with a new generation of radio systems that allowed them to communicate clearly and effectively, even under the most chaotic battlefield conditions. The SCR-508 radios, with their frequency modulation technology, provided American tank crews with the ability to coordinate attacks, report enemy positions, and call for support in real time. This technological advantage allowed American forces to act as a cohesive unit, capable of adapting to changes in the battlefield and executing complex maneuvers with remarkable precision. While the Germans focused on improving the armor and firepower of their tanks, they neglected the importance of communication. As a result, their tanks, no matter how well armored or powerful, could not operate in concert with each other. When one tank was destroyed or immobilized, the entire platoon could lose coordination, leaving them exposed to the superior American tactics. The Americans, however, could rely on their radio systems to keep every tank connected, allowing them to act as a unified force, even when separated by miles of rugged terrain. This ability to fight as a cohesive unit, rather than a collection of isolated vehicles, was the key to American success. The superiority of the American communication systems allowed them to exploit the weaknesses of the German forces and maintain constant pressure throughout the battlefield. The Germans, on the other hand, found themselves fighting a war where their advanced tanks could not overcome the strategic advantage provided by American radio communication. This became particularly evident in key battles, such as the Battle of Kasserine Pass, where the American tanks, despite being outnumbered and facing difficult conditions, were able to coordinate their movements and respond to German threats with remarkable speed. In the end, the ability to maintain reliable communication across the battlefield was the decisive factor in the outcome of the war. The Germans, with their reliance on outdated radio systems, could not adapt to the fast-moving and highly coordinated American forces. The American radio networks, which connected every tank to every other unit, provided a level of coordination that was unparalleled in modern warfare. The result was a technological revolution that redefined the nature of combat. The ability to communicate, to share information instantly and efficiently, became just as important as the tanks themselves. The impact of this lesson would be felt for decades to come. The victory of the American forces was not just a victory of tanks, but of information and technology. The radio systems that connected every American tank became the model for future military communication. The ability to fight as a unified, coordinated force, rather than as isolated units, became the foundation for modern warfare. In hindsight, the German military's failure to adapt to this new reality was a critical oversight. The war had shown that information dominance was just as crucial as firepower. The German tanks, though superior in many respects, were ultimately outmatched by the American ability to communicate and coordinate on the battlefield. This shift in the nature of warfare had profound implications for the future, and it set the stage for the development of modern military strategies that would prioritize connectivity and coordination above all else. The technological advancements in communication that had been pioneered during World War II would continue to shape military strategies throughout the Cold War and beyond. The importance of information, and the ability to share it quickly and effectively, would become a central theme in military doctrine. The lessons learned from the American success in World War II, where communication and coordination proved to be the keys to victory, would continue to inform military tactics for generations to come. The failure of the Germans to adapt to these new realities marked the end of one era of warfare and the beginning of a new one, where the battle for information would be just as important as the battle for territory. Ultimately, the story of World War II was not just one of tanks and soldiers, but of how technology and innovation reshaped the very nature of warfare. The Americans had demonstrated that the side with the most advanced and effective communication systems would be the one to prevail. This realization would change the course of history, and the lessons of the war would continue to influence military strategies for decades to come. The morning of February 20th, 1943, saw the skies over northern Tunisia shrouded in smoke and dust from the chaos of battle. German tank commanders stood in disbelief as they observed something they could not comprehend. A series of American Sherman tanks spread across a broken battlefield, maneuvering in a way that defied all known military doctrine. Tanks that were separated by miles of rough terrain, with no visual communication between them, seemed to move as if they were one single unit. There were no signals, no visible coordination, no flags, no flares, no dispatch riders racing across the ground. And yet, each tank knew exactly where the others were, moving with perfect synchronization. This was not just a lucky coincidence. The Germans, who had prided themselves on their own tanks and highly structured communication methods, were witnessing something that appeared almost supernatural. Their own Panzer Fus, equipped with radios that could barely reach beyond a few hundred meters, were struggling to maintain contact even within their own platoons. The static from their systems was overwhelming. Meanwhile, the American tanks, without visible command structures in the traditional sense, were operating with a technology the Germans had no knowledge of. A communication system that was as invisible as it was revolutionary. The Americans were using frequency modulation radios, devices the Germans didn't even know existed in the military world. These radios, with a 25-watt transmission power, cut through the battlefield noise with the clarity of a well-tuned instrument. Unlike the Germans' 10-watt radios, which had been state-of-the-art in the 1930s but were now woefully inadequate, the American radios allowed their crews to communicate effortlessly, even amid the deafening noise of gunfire, artillery shells, and tank engines. This technological advantage was not in the tank's armor or firepower, but in the electromagnetic waves that allowed every tank to operate as part of a synchronized system. The transformation began long before the battle at Kasserine Pass. In 1941, the U.S. military, recognizing the necessity of reliable communication for tank operations, began to equip its medium tanks with the SCR-508, SCR-528, and SCR-538 radios. These radios used FM technology, which eliminated the static and interference common in the older AM radios used by the Germans. The result was a communication system that allowed American forces to coordinate tank movements across the battlefield with an unprecedented level of clarity and speed. What the Germans could not grasp was the magnitude of the advantage they were up against. While their own tanks struggled with limited communication capabilities, the Americans had created a network in which every tank was connected to every other tank, forming a cohesive, highly effective fighting force. German commanders could only watch in frustration as they were outmaneuvered and out-coordinated by the seemingly supernatural abilities of the American forces. For the Germans, this realization would come too late. They had believed that victory on the battlefield would be determined by superior tanks, better armor, and larger guns. But they had overlooked a critical factor: the ability to communicate effectively across the battlefield, to move as a coordinated unit, and to outthink the enemy with superior strategy. The American radios didn't just allow for communication. They transformed the entire nature of warfare, creating a flexible, fast, and responsive army that the Germans were simply unprepared to fight. As the battle raged on, it became clear that the Americans, equipped with their new technology, had a significant advantage. The German tanks, though superior in firepower and armor, were being outmaneuvered and outgunned by a more connected and better coordinated force. This was a battle not of tanks, but of systems. And the American system was winning. The Germans had underestimated the power of communication, and it was a mistake that would cost them dearly. The Sherman tanks, with their advanced radios, were not just fighting machines. They were the backbone of a new kind of warfare, one where the ability to communicate in real time would determine the outcome of battles and ultimately, the war. On February 20th, 1943, in the desolate and war-torn expanse of northern Tunisia, German commanders found themselves witness to something they could not comprehend. Through the haze of dust and smoke from the ongoing battle, they watched in stunned silence as American Sherman tanks moved across the battlefield with a fluidity and precision that seemed almost supernatural. These tanks, separated by vast stretches of broken terrain, executed maneuvers that defied every principle of warfare that the German army had adhered to for years. How could they move so effortlessly, without a line of sight between them? There were no flags signaling orders, No flares marking positions, no dispatch riders speeding across the landscape. And yet, these tanks, divided by miles of jagged ground, acted as though they were a single, cohesive unit. In the world of armored warfare, the Germans had long believed that effective coordination depended on visual contact between units or the use of traditional communication methods, like runners or dispatch riders. This system had worked for them in the past, particularly during the Blitzkrieg campaigns. However, what they were witnessing on that fateful day in Tunisia shattered everything they knew about battlefield communication and coordination. American tanks were operating with a level of synchronization that seemed almost impossible under the circumstances. Each tank seemed to know exactly where its comrades were positioned, moving in perfect unison even though the terrain and visibility would have made such coordination nearly impossible with their own methods. The German tanks, equipped with the FUG-5 radios, struggled to communicate even with their own platoons. These radios, which were state-of-the-art by 1930 standards, emitted only 10 watts of power and were unable to cut through the chaos of battle. The static that overwhelmed their systems made it nearly impossible for commanders to communicate effectively, leaving tank crews struggling to make sense of the situation. Worse still, many of the German tanks were equipped only with receivers, unable to transmit orders or request assistance. This serious limitation meant that German forces were often left fighting in isolation, unable to coordinate with other units or receive vital support when needed. Meanwhile, the Americans were operating with a completely different kind of technology. The Sherman tanks had been equipped with radios that employed frequency modulation, FM, rather than the more common amplitude modulation, AM, used by the Germans. These FM radios, developed by the engineers at Galvin Manufacturing Company, later known as Motorola, offered clarity and stability that the Germans couldn't have imagined. With 25 watts of power, these radios could easily cut through the noise of engines, gunfire, and explosions. This was a level of communication that German tank crews simply could not match, and it would soon prove to be a decisive factor in the American forces' ability to conduct coordinated and efficient operations. This technological superiority allowed the American tanks to operate as a network, where each tank could communicate with the others and share vital information in real time. The clarity of the FM radios allowed the American crews to warn each other of threats, call for support, and coordinate attacks across the battlefield. The Germans, meanwhile, were forced to rely on outdated systems that simply couldn't keep up with the demands of modern warfare. This was the first glimpse of a new kind of war, one where technological advancements in communication would prove just as important as firepower or armor. The Germans had long prided themselves on their technological advancements in tank design, and their tanks were some of the most formidable on the battlefield. The Panzerabwehrfähre, with their thick armor and powerful guns, were feared by enemies across Europe and North Africa. Yet, despite their superior firepower, these tanks were hampered by their inability to communicate effectively. This vulnerability became painfully clear in Tunisia, where American tanks, operating with their superior communication systems, were able to outmaneuver and outfight the Germans. As the battle raged on, the German commanders could not ignore the fact that the American tanks were performing feats that were once thought impossible without direct visual contact. What they didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The battle at Kasserine Pass would soon reveal the full extent of American radio superiority. While the Germans struggled to coordinate their forces, the American tanks, despite being spread out across the battlefield, communicated effortlessly and moved with precision. The Germans, despite having the advantage in terms of tank design and firepower, found themselves increasingly outclassed by the Americans, whose radios allowed them to act as a unified force. This moment would mark a turning point in the war, not because of the size of the tanks or the power of their guns, but because of the power of communication. The American tanks, armed with their FM radios, were able to create a battlefield network that rendered traditional tactics obsolete. The German tanks, despite their superior design, could not coordinate their movements effectively, and their inability to communicate in real time proved to be their undoing. The American advantage in communication, which seemed insignificant at first, would become one of the most decisive factors in the outcome of the war. The Germans, with their outdated technology and rigid communication systems, were left struggling to adapt to a battlefield where information and coordination were just as important as firepower and armor. By the end of the battle, the German commanders had learned a hard lesson. In modern warfare, communication was just as important as the weapons and armor that made up their tanks. And for the Americans, this was only the beginning of a technological revolution that would change the course of the war. The radios in their tanks were not just a tool. They were the key to unlocking a new way of fighting, one where coordination and communication would be the deciding factors in the battles to come. As soon as American commanders and engineers realized the strategic advantage provided by their radio communication systems, a new vision began to take shape for how this technology could be applied in the field. Engineers, particularly from companies like Motorola, recognized the immense potential of radio systems to change the nature of armored warfare. These engineers were tasked with developing advanced communication technologies that would elevate the effectiveness of American tanks far beyond anything the Germans had at their disposal. In the early stages of 1942, the U.S. Army began equipping its Sherman tanks with the SCR-508 radio system, marking a significant leap in battlefield communication. The SCR-508 was powered by a 25-watt transmission system, far surpassing the capabilities of the German FUG-5 radios, which were limited to just 10 watts. This increased power allowed American tanks to maintain clear, reliable communication across much larger distances and through far more interference than their German counterparts could manage. In the context of World War II, where every tactical advantage could mean the difference between life and death, the development of these technologies proved to be the key to creating highly efficient, coordinated fighting units. The creation of this technology was not just a matter of applying existing ideas, but required an entirely new approach to military communication. The engineers worked diligently on refining frequency modulation, FM technology, which had already proven effective in civilian radio applications. However, it was the military's application of FM technology that would transform the battlefield. The FM radios, like the SCR-508, were designed to eliminate the static and interference that plagued the German AM systems. These radios used crystal-controlled frequencies, which ensured greater stability and clarity even in the most chaotic conditions. One of the challenges of developing a military-grade radio was ensuring that it could withstand the rough conditions of warfare. Tanks, with their constant vibrations and exposure to extreme conditions, presented an entirely different set of problems compared to standard civilian radio installations. Despite these difficulties, the engineers were able to create a system that not only survived, but thrived in these harsh environments. The SCR-508 radio's frequency stability ensured that it could maintain clear communication even during artillery bombardments and other battlefield chaos. This reliability proved vital as American tank crews used their radios to coordinate complex maneuvers and share vital intelligence about enemy positions, something the German forces could not achieve due to their inferior communication technology. The breakthrough came when American engineers fully integrated FM technology into military vehicles, allowing each tank to become a node in a comprehensive battlefield network. Previously, commanders relied on visual signals, flags, or runners to communicate orders across tanks and units. However, the American radio system enabled every tank to be in constant contact with one another, providing immediate access to critical information and allowing for synchronized maneuvers. This was a marked shift from German tactics, which depended on rigid hierarchical communication systems that could easily be disrupted by the loss of a command vehicle or a breakdown in the chain of communication. For the German forces, this new level of communication was a revelation they had not anticipated. Their radio systems, though advanced for their time, could only operate within very limited ranges and were prone to interference. The FUG-5 radios used by the Germans, while capable of receiving and transmitting orders, were severely hampered by static and poor frequency stability. In the heat of battle, German commanders were often left in the dark, unable to coordinate effectively with their subordinates or respond quickly to changing conditions. This communication gap became a critical vulnerability that would only grow more apparent as the war progressed. While the Germans were still relying on old-fashioned methods of coordination, the Americans were already moving to the next phase of technological innovation. With each passing day, more Sherman tanks were equipped with the new radio systems, and the U.S. Army began to see the impact of this technological leap. The ability to communicate instantly, regardless of the battlefield conditions, gave American forces a distinct advantage, enabling them to respond faster and more effectively than their German counterparts. At the same time, the engineers continued to refine the technology. They worked on improving the range of the radios, further reducing interference, and developing ways to integrate the radios with other forms of military communication, such as artillery and infantry radios. By late 1943, the American military had achieved near-perfect integration of their communication systems, ensuring that every component of the Army, from tank crews to infantry to artillery, could coordinate seamlessly. This level of coordination was unprecedented, and it set the stage for the next phase of the war, where technology and information would play an ever-increasing role in determining the outcome of battles. The strategic application of these radios, and the broader shift toward a more networked approach to warfare, laid the foundation for what would later become the cornerstone of modern military doctrine. The success of the SCR-508 radio was not just about the technology itself, but about how it was integrated into the overall strategy of the U.S. Army. It allowed for a level of flexibility and adaptability on the battlefield that German forces could not match. In a way, the radios themselves became a force multiplier, enabling American tank crews to perform feats that would have been unimaginable without the ability to communicate effectively. By the time the Allies entered Italy in 1943, the effects of the new radios were evident. American tanks, even when separated by vast distances or challenging terrain, could maintain clear communication with one another. This ability to coordinate without relying on visual contact or physical signals allowed the Americans to outmaneuver and outthink the German forces, even in the rugged, mountainous terrain of Italy. The results were undeniable. American tanks, operating with the new radios, were able to execute complex tactical maneuvers and communicate across previously impassable ground. This breakthrough was not just a matter of technological superiority, it was a fundamental shift in how war was conducted. With clear and reliable communication, American forces were able to fight with greater coordination, precision, and speed. The impact of this shift was felt in every theater of the war, from the deserts of North Africa to the hedgerows of Normandy. The ability to maintain clear communication in the midst of chaos gave the Americans a decisive advantage over the Germans, who were still operating with outdated and unreliable communication systems. As the war continued, the radio technology that had been developed for the Sherman tanks became a symbol of American industrial might and ingenuity. It was a testament to the power of innovation and the ability to adapt quickly in the face of adversity. The engineers who had worked on these systems were at the forefront of a revolution in military communication, and their work would have far-reaching implications for future conflicts. In the end, the success of the American radio systems was not just a technical achievement, it was a strategic one. The radios allowed for the creation of a flexible, responsive, and well-coordinated fighting force, one that could operate as a single entity, no matter how far apart its units were. This new approach to warfare would come to define the future of modern combat, where communication, coordination, and adaptability would be as important as firepower and armor. The SCR-508 radio was not just a tool, it was the key to unlocking a new era of military strategy. In February 1943, as American tanks entered the fray during the Battle of Kasserine Pass, the true power of their radio systems became glaringly evident. Despite the Germans emerging victorious tactically, the battle exposed significant vulnerabilities in their communication and coordination systems. Even the most experienced German tank commanders, who had relied on their methods for years, could not help but notice the stark contrast between their operations and those of the Americans. The German forces, operating with outdated and unreliable communication technology, struggled to maintain cohesion across the battlefield. Meanwhile, the American tank crews, equipped with their new frequency modulation, FM radios, were executing maneuvers and coordinating attacks over distances that were unimaginable for the Germans. The Kasserine Pass battle itself was a chaotic affair, with both sides facing a confusing and disjointed battlefield. For the Germans, this was nothing new. Their tactics had always relied on clear, visual communication between units, or, in the case of their tanks, relying on the radios for orders that could be passed down the chain of command. However, the American tanks, operating with an entirely different approach, were able to bypass the traditional constraints of visual signals or direct contact. Despite being spread across a 50-mile front, the American tanks, using their FM radios, were able to synchronize their actions flawlessly, coordinating attacks and defense with precision. The Germans, on the other hand, found their own communication systems lacking in almost every aspect. Their radios, though they had once been state-of-the-art, could not compare to the clarity and reliability of the American systems. German tank platoons, which were supposed to be able to act as a cohesive fighting force, were often fractured due to poor communication. Many tanks could only receive orders but were unable to transmit any information in return. Worse yet, the FUG-5 radios on most of their tanks were overwhelmed by the noise of combat, leaving crews with little understanding of what was happening around them. Their communication was limited to whatever they could see or hear with their own eyes, a severe handicap in the fog of war. This gap in communication was exposed on a grand scale during the battle. While the Germans were focused on their tactical maneuvers, they were blind to the American tanks' superior ability to respond, adapt, and coordinate across vast stretches of terrain. Each American Sherman tank was linked to a wider network, able to report enemy movements, call for artillery strikes, or signal for reinforcements at the touch of a button. The clarity of their radios allowed for a real-time exchange of information that could not be matched by the German forces. The Germans, despite their superior tank design and firepower, were operating at a disadvantage. They could not react fast enough to the rapidly shifting American forces. What had once seemed impossible, the ability to conduct synchronized tank operations without visual contact, was now a reality on the battlefield. As the battle unfolded, it became increasingly clear that this technological advantage was more than just a luxury. It was a game changer. German tank commanders could see the Americans adapting in ways they had never imagined. Tanks that were separated by miles were still able to act as a cohesive unit, as if guided by a central brain. The German forces, on the other hand, were often left struggling to respond to threats they could not anticipate or communicate about in time. The result was a failure to execute their doctrine effectively, leaving them vulnerable to attacks they could neither plan for nor respond to in real time. The battle at Kasserine Pass demonstrated a fundamental shift in warfare. The importance of communication was laid bare, revealing that the battle was no longer about firepower alone, but about the ability to share information, make decisions quickly, and coordinate with units over vast distances. American tanks, with their advanced radios, were able to operate as a network, leveraging the collective strength of their forces in ways that the Germans could not. This realization would have profound implications for the future of the war, as the Germans would begin to see that the key to success was not just having superior tanks, but having the ability to coordinate those tanks in real time, across any terrain and in any situation. For the Germans, this new reality was a hard pill to swallow. Their doctrine, based on the superiority of their tanks and their ability to operate independently, had been undermined by a force that didn't rely on brute strength, but on seamless communication. As the battle continued, German commanders began to recognize that their traditional methods were becoming obsolete. Despite their best efforts, they could not match the coordination of the American forces, who were able to anticipate each move and respond with devastating speed and efficiency. The Germans were caught in a tactical nightmare, unable to adapt to the new dynamics of modern warfare. The significance of the American radio systems became fully apparent by the end of the battle. It wasn't the tanks themselves that had won the day, but the ability of the American forces to communicate effectively and coordinate their actions across the battlefield. The Germans, despite their technological superiority in certain areas, were left grasping at straws as their communications faltered. Their failure to understand and adapt to the power of the American radio network proved to be one of their most critical mistakes of the war. What the German commanders had failed to realize was that the battlefield was evolving into a place where communication would decide the outcome of the war. The American tanks, connected by a sophisticated web of communication, could maneuver, respond, and adapt faster than their adversaries. The Germans, despite having superior firepower, could not overcome the strategic advantage provided by American communication superiority. In this battle, it was clear. Information was just as important as ammunition, and the side that could share that information most effectively would emerge victorious. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was a defining moment for both sides. For the Germans, it exposed the vulnerabilities of their communication systems and forced them to confront the reality that their traditional methods of warfare were no longer enough. For the Americans, it was a glimpse into the future of warfare. A future where the ability to communicate and coordinate across the battlefield would become the most important factor in determining the outcome of conflicts. The battle marked the beginning of a shift in how wars would be fought and won. The emphasis would no longer be solely on the strength of individual tanks, but on the strength of the networks that connected them. As the American forces moved forward in the Italian campaign, the advantages of the SCR-508 radio systems became even more apparent. The rugged, mountainous terrain of Italy, which posed significant challenges for traditional communication methods, highlighted the superiority of the frequency modulation, FM radios. In regions where visual contact between tanks was nearly impossible due to the landscape, the American tanks remained connected through their radio systems, allowing them to coordinate and execute maneuvers that would have been unthinkable with the German communication systems. The ability of American tank crews to communicate instantly, despite being separated by valleys and ridgelines, demonstrated a level of tactical flexibility that the Germans simply could not replicate. German tanks, operating with outdated amplitude modulation, AM radios, faced severe limitations in these environments. Their radios struggled to overcome the interference caused by the rough terrain, and they often lost contact when their tanks were separated by even short distances. Without reliable communication, the Germans had to rely on rigid formations and prearranged plans, which greatly reduced their ability to adapt to rapidly changing situations. American tanks, on the other hand, operated as part of a coordinated network, with each tank able to relay information and receive orders in real time. This gave them a significant advantage in maintaining momentum, even in the most challenging conditions. In Italy, the American tanks were able to advance with remarkable efficiency, coordinating their movements across the battlefield without the need for visual confirmation. They could maneuver in ways that left their German counterparts at a disadvantage, unable to react as swiftly or effectively. The American tanks were not limited by the same communication constraints that hindered the Germans. They were able to operate across the landscape in a way that allowed them to maintain their offensive, even as the terrain worked against them. This was a testament to the power of the radio systems, which had turned the battlefield into a more connected, synchronized environment. The success in Italy further demonstrated the effectiveness of the American communication systems. The ability to stay connected, despite the challenges of mountainous terrain, was a critical factor in the success of the American armored divisions. Where the Germans had relied on visual signals or hand gestures to communicate, the Americans were able to transmit orders, report enemy positions, and coordinate movements with unparalleled speed and precision. This allowed American forces to capitalize on their mobility, which the Germans could not match. Even when American tanks were operating in isolated areas, they were never truly alone, thanks to their superior communication systems. The contrast between the two armies was stark. While the Germans struggled to maintain cohesion among their tanks, the Americans were operating with a level of coordination that was unheard of in previous wars. The German tanks, despite their superior armor and firepower, were unable to adapt as quickly or effectively as their American counterparts. The ability to communicate across the battlefield, without the need for visual confirmation or rigid formations, allowed the American tanks to exploit weaknesses in the German lines and strike with precision. The result was a series of victories that demonstrated the true power of modern communication technology on the battlefield. A critical point in this technological superiority came in June 1944, during the D-Day invasion of Normandy. As American forces stormed the beaches, they quickly realized that the communication between infantry and tanks was not as seamless as it needed to be. Tanks, with their SCR-508 radios, could communicate with each other across the battlefield, but the infantry units, operating on different frequencies, struggled to coordinate with the tanks. This gap in communication could have proven disastrous, especially in the fast-paced and unpredictable environment of the invasion. However, the American military's ability to adapt quickly and effectively proved to be a decisive factor. Engineers swiftly developed a solution by installing field telephones inside the tanks, connecting them directly to infantry units. This simple modification allowed the tanks to maintain communication with the infantry in real time, ensuring that the two forces could operate in sync. The integration of these phones into the tanks revolutionized the way American units coordinated, turning the tank and infantry units into a seamless fighting force. The ability to coordinate tank and infantry movements through this improved communication system was instrumental in the success of the invasion. This adaptation was a turning point in the development of modern armored warfare. The new system allowed tanks and infantry to work together with greater efficiency, making them a much more formidable force. The American forces were no longer limited by the need for visual contact or rigid plans. They could react to changes on the battlefield almost instantaneously. This new level of coordination became a hallmark of the American strategy, and it played a significant role in the success of future operations. The improvements in communication technology also had a psychological impact on the battlefield. As the American tanks and infantry moved in perfect coordination, the Germans began to realize that they were facing an enemy that was not only superior in firepower and numbers, but also in the ability to organize and coordinate on a scale they could not match. The Germans had pioneered the concept of blitzkrieg, which relied on speed and surprise. But the Americans were now showing that coordination and communication could be just as deadly as any tank or gun. In the subsequent months, as the Allies advanced through France and into Germany, the American tanks continued to demonstrate their superiority. The ability to coordinate attacks, share intelligence, and respond to threats in real time gave the American forces a significant advantage. This success in Italy, Normandy, and beyond highlighted the importance of communication systems in modern warfare. The SCR-508 radios and the modifications made to integrate them with infantry units allowed the American forces to fight as a unified force, making them a formidable adversary. The ability to adapt and improve the communication systems on the battlefield ultimately proved to be a decisive factor in the American success during the war. The rapid advancements in military technology, particularly in radio communication, changed the way wars were fought and laid the foundation for modern battlefield coordination. In the face of overwhelming odds, the American forces, equipped with their superior communication systems, were able to outmaneuver and outfight the Germans, leading to a series of crucial victories that would eventually bring an end to the war in Europe. As the American forces pushed deeper into Germany, it became increasingly clear that the technological revolution in radio communications had played a crucial role in their victories. This advantage, once underestimated, was now recognized as one of the decisive factors that shaped the outcome of the war. The importance of this communication superiority was acknowledged at all levels of command, from individual tank crews to the highest strategic planning. With each passing day, as the American forces advanced, it became evident that their technological edge was not just about superior equipment, but about the ability to maintain coordination and synchronization on the battlefield like never before. Throughout the war, American radio technology had been evolving, with new innovations and adaptations that kept the American forces one step ahead of their enemies. The SCR-508 radios, initially a game-changing innovation, were constantly refined and integrated into new systems to ensure seamless communication between all units, from tanks to infantry and command posts. The ability to share information instantly, coordinate movements, and respond to threats in real time was a power that the Germans could never match. The American forces had developed a system that allowed them to act as a unified force, a collective intelligence that no amount of technological superiority in tanks or weaponry could overcome. Germany, despite its advancements in tank production and weaponry, could not overcome the technological gap in communications. The German reliance on outdated radio technology, with its static-filled transmissions and limited range, left them vulnerable to American tactics. The Germans had built some of the best tanks in the world, but without the ability to communicate effectively, their forces were often isolated, unable to act in concert or respond to the dynamic and fast-moving American operations. This communication breakdown was not only a technical failure but a strategic one, undermining the Germans' ability to fight as a cohesive unit. By the time the war was nearing its end, the Americans had not only destroyed the German military's tanks and weapons, but had also dismantled their strategic doctrine. The German forces, which had once relied on speed, surprise, and concentrated firepower, found themselves outmaneuvered by an enemy that could coordinate attacks and responses with unparalleled precision. American tanks, equipped with their superior radios, had redefined the battlefield. It was no longer enough to have the best tanks or the most powerful artillery. The true advantage now lay in the ability to communicate, to act as a single unified force, no matter the size or complexity of the battlefield. This transformation was not just a matter of technological superiority, it was a matter of how that technology was used to reshape the nature of warfare itself. American tank crews, armed with their advanced radios, could coordinate their movements across vast distances, overcoming obstacles and terrain that would have stymied any other force. They could react instantly to changes in the battlefield, adapting their tactics on the fly, while the German forces were still tied to rigid formations and outdated communication methods. The Germans, despite their strengths in other areas, were fighting a war where their ability to communicate effectively was increasingly irrelevant. The end result of this technological gap was a complete breakdown of German strategy. The Germans, who had once been masters of battlefield coordination through their own radio systems, were now unable to keep up with the pace of the American advances. Their tactical doctrine, built on quick strikes and concentrated force, was no longer viable in the face of American flexibility and technological supremacy. American radio systems had turned the tide of the war, creating an entirely new paradigm for how battles could be fought and won. As the Allies closed in on Germany, the superior coordination provided by the American radio systems allowed them to deliver crushing blows to the German defenses. Every unit, from tanks to infantry, could work together as one cohesive force, reacting to threats, exploiting weaknesses, and executing complex maneuvers with unparalleled efficiency. The German forces, meanwhile, were left scrambling to adapt, unable to maintain communication across their ranks, and unable to coordinate effectively in the face of such overwhelming synchronized opposition. This shift in the nature of warfare had profound implications for the future. The victory of the Allies in Europe was not just a result of superior firepower or manpower, but also the triumph of information warfare. The ability to coordinate and communicate across vast distances, to synchronize attacks and responses, had proven to be the most decisive factor in the outcome of the conflict. The SCR-508 and its successors had laid the groundwork for a new era of warfare, one in which technological superiority in communication would be as important as any other factor on the battlefield. As the war came to a close, the lessons of the conflict were clear. The Americans had demonstrated that in modern warfare, the side with the best communication system could overcome any other advantage. The German military, despite its advanced tanks and weapons, had been outmatched by the American ability to share information and coordinate actions in real time. The war had not only been won through superior technology, but through the effective integration of that technology into every aspect of military strategy. The battlefield had changed forever, and the victory in Europe was as much a triumph of communication as it was of military might. The consequences of this technological shift went beyond the war itself. The lessons learned from the success of the American radio systems would influence military strategy and technology for decades to come. In the post-war world, the ability to communicate effectively and maintain coordination across vast distances would become a cornerstone of military doctrine. The victory in Europe had demonstrated the importance of a connected battlefield, and this understanding would shape the development of future military technologies, from the Cold War to modern conflicts. Looking back, it was clear that the war had been decided not just by tanks or artillery, but by the ability to communicate and coordinate. The superior American radio systems had enabled the Allies to move faster, react more effectively, and ultimately defeat an enemy that could no longer keep up. The battlefield had been transformed into a network, where information was as powerful as firepower. This revolution in military communications had sealed the fate of the German military and reshaped the future of warfare for generations to come. The Germans had long prided themselves on their tanks, particularly the Panther and Tiger models, which were unmatched in terms of armor and firepower. However, these technological marvels were rendered ineffective on the battlefield due to the lack of coordination. Their radio systems, relying on outdated technology, were plagued by static, poor range, and interference. The inability to maintain reliable communication between units left the German forces vulnerable. They could not respond to threats quickly enough or coordinate their attacks with the precision required to defeat the well-organized American forces. This lack of coordination became a critical weakness, one that American radio systems exploited with devastating effect.